Opening Declaration, Westside Grace Ministries, Bishop Michael Anthony McDaniel, CSI, Critical Scripture Investigator, FBI, Forensic Bible Investigator, Senior Investigator, Westside Grace Ministries, Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth Through Investigative Scripture Analysis, Doctoral Forensic Biblical Study, Do Not Muzzle the Ox, Does Paul Quote Moses? A CSI Interpretive Journey, Investigation with MSM Framework and Apologetics Analysis. Introduction. Few passages better demonstrate the unity of Scripture than Paul's quotation of Moses concerning the unmuzzled ox. What appears at first glance to be a simple agricultural regulation becomes a major apostolic argument concerning ministry, labor, justice, hermeneutics, and the authority of Scripture itself. Many readers assume Paul changed the meaning of Moses. Others claim Paul used Old Testament verses carelessly. Still others argue the New Testament writers manipulated Hebrew Bible texts to support theological agendas. This CSI forensic investigation will examine the evidence carefully. The study asks an investigative question. Are you investigating the Bible or are you guessing? This study will examine whether Paul actually quotes Moses, whether Paul changes the original meaning, how biblical case law functions, how apostolic interpretation operates, and what this passage teaches about labor, ministry, and covenant justice. Definition of pericope. A pericope is a complete literary and contextual unit within Scripture containing a unified scene, argument, narrative, teaching, or discourse. Pericope identification is essential because investigators cannot interpret correctly if they contaminate scene boundaries. Biblical scene data category, information primary, Old Testament passage, Deuteronomy 25, 4 New Testament citations, 1 Corinthians 9, 1-14, 1 Timothy 5, 17, 18, human authors Moses and Paul genre covenant law, apostolic epistle time period, Deuteronomy, c. 1406 BC, Pauline epistles, AD 55-65, geographic setting, plains of Moab, Corinth, Ephesus audience Israel, Corinthian church, Ephesian church, main focus justice in labor and ministry support, a CSI step pericope, scene boundary control, primary pericope, Deuteronomy 25, 1-4. The immediate context concerns judicial fairness, punishment limitations, humane treatment, covenant justice, ethical responsibility. The ox command appears within a broader legal framework of righteousness and fairness. In full scripture evidence, Deuteronomy 25:4, KJV, thou shalt not muzzle the ox when he treadeth out the corn. At first glance, the command appears merely agricultural. However, CSI investigation requires deeper examination. CSI interrogation module. Question: why would such a short verse become important enough for Paul to quote repeatedly? Answer: because biblical case law often contains covenant principles larger than the immediate illustration itself. The ox is the visible example. Justice in labor is the enduring principle. CSI Step 1, Grasping the Text in Their Town. Historical reconstruction threshing floors in the ancient Near East operated through animal labor. Oxen walked repeatedly over grain in order to separate kernels from husks. Some owners placed muzzles on animals to prevent them from eating while working. The Mosaic Law prohibited this practice. CSI Scene Evidence. Number 1. The law restrains exploitation. The animal participates in productive labor. Therefore, the laboring creature is allowed participation in the fruit of labor. The law restrains greed. Evidence number 2, Mosaic Law, uses case law structures. This is critically important. Biblical law frequently teaches through representative cases. This is called case law. Case law gives a concrete example containing a broader covenant principle. Examples include building parapets on roofs, returning lost property, honest scales and weights, gleaning laws, marriage laws, agricultural commands. The CSI investigator must distinguish the immediate case from the governing principle beneath the case. CSI interrogation module. Question: was Moses only concerned about animal rights? Answer: no. The text certainly includes humane treatment. However, reducing the passage to animal ethics alone ignores the broader covenant structure. The command teaches fairness, participation in labor, anti-exploitation ethics, covenant justice. CSI interrogation module. Question: how do we know broader principles are intended? Answer: because Deuteronomic law repeatedly moves from specific examples to universal covenant ethics. The laws function pedagogically. Israel learned righteousness through concrete legal scenes. In CSI Step 2, measuring the width of the river, understanding the cultural distance. Modern readers often misunderstand biblical law because modern economies differ. Agricultural imagery feels foreign. Covenant structures are ignored, and modern interpretation tends toward either hyperliteralism or radical allegory. Paul avoids both extremes. He neither ignores the original meaning nor confines the text only to agriculture. CSI apologetics analysis, skeptical claim. Paul takes Moses out of context. Investigative response. This accusation misunderstands Jewish interpretive methodology. Paul uses covenant reasoning, typology, case law extension, and lesser to greater logic. These methods were deeply rooted in Jewish theological interpretation. Paul is not violating the text. He is following the trajectory already embedded within the text. CSI interrogation module. Question: did Moses himself expect future generations to extract enduring principles from covenant laws? Answer: yes. Deuteronomy consistently teaches principles through legal examples. The covenant community was expected to think covenantally. The laws trained moral reasoning. CSI Step 3, crossing the principalizing bridge, extracting the timeless principle. The timeless principle becomes: those who labor should benefit from their labor. This principle extends beyond oxen, agriculture, and ancient Israel. It applies to workers, servants, laborers, and ministers. Paul's apostolic interpretation, 1 Corinthians 9, 8, 10, KJV. Say I these things as a man, or saith not the law the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, Thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Doth God take care for oxen? Or saith he it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written. CSI interrogation module. Question: is Paul denying that God cares about animals? Answer: absolutely not. Some interpreters badly mishandle Paul here. Scripture clearly teaches God's concern for creation. Proverbs 12:10, KJV. A righteous man regardeth the life of his beast. Jonah 4:11, KJV. And also much cattle. Paul's argument is not, God does not care about oxen. His argument is, the principle extends beyond oxen. This is a classic lesser to greater argument. If God protects working animals, how much more does he care about human laborers? CSI interrogation module. Question: why does Paul connect this law to ministry? Answer: because ministry is labor. Paul argues that spiritual laborers should receive material support. The labor principle transcends agricultural context. To CSI Step 4, consulting the biblical map. Correlating Scripture with Scripture. The Bible consistently supports fair labor practices. No. Old Testament evidence, Leviticus 19:13, KJV. Thou shalt not defraud thy neighbor, neither rob him. The wages of him that is hired shall not abide with thee all night until the morning. Deuteronomy 24:14-15 KJV. Thou shalt not oppress an hired servant that is poor and needy. At his day thou shalt give him his hire. New Testament evidence, Luke 10:7 KJV. For the laborer is worthy of his hire. Jesus himself affirms the principle. 1 Timothy 5:17-18 KJV. Let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor. For the scripture saith, Thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn, and the laborer is worthy of his reward. CSI interrogation, module. Question: what is remarkable about Paul's use of scripture in 1 Timothy? Answer: Paul places Deuteronomy and Luke's gospel under the shared category scripture. This demonstrates apostolic recognition of divine authority. CSI Step 5, Grasping the Text in Our Town, Modern Application. This study confronts modern church culture directly. Modern error. 1. Exploiting ministers. Some churches expect full-time labor, emotional investment, spiritual leadership, counseling, teaching, shepherding, while refusing proper support. Paul condemns exploitation. Modern error. Number 2, commercialized ministry. Other ministries weaponize these verses for greed. The text does not justify celebrity culture, manipulation, prosperity exploitation, or ministry profiteering. The principle is fair support, not financial corruption. MSM framework analysis, M, meaning. The original meaning concerns covenant justice regarding labor participation. S, significance. The significance includes economic ethics, ministry support, anti-exploitation principles, stewardship, and covenant fairness. M, modern application. Modern believers must honor labor fairly, avoid greed, avoid exploitation, support faithful ministry responsibly, and interpret Scripture contextually. CSI Apologetics Cross-Examination Objection. Paul changed the meaning of Moses. Response: no, Paul preserved the governing covenant principle already embedded within the law. At objection: the New Testament abuses the Old Testament. Response: false. The apostles interpreted Scripture through covenant theology, typology, and case law continuity. A. Objection: this passage is only about animals. Response: the immediate case involves animals. The enduring principle concerns justice in labor. Both dimensions are true simultaneously. The investigator must avoid reductionism. Final investigative verdict: yes. Paul absolutely quotes Moses. More importantly, Paul correctly interprets Moses within the framework of covenant case law. The apostle demonstrates continuity between Old and New Testament revelation, covenant coherence, and theological unity across Scripture. The Ox Law is not random agricultural trivia. It is covenant justice in visible form. CSI closing summary. This forensic investigation revealed that Moses established a covenant principle through case law. Paul faithfully applied that principle, and the unity of Scripture remains intact from Torah to apostolic teaching. The investigator discovers that biblical law contains layered theological depth. Apostolic interpretation operates covenantally, and Scripture interprets Scripture consistently. The unmuzzled ox becomes a theological witness to justice, fairness, righteous labor, and faithful interpretation. The study asks again, are you investigating the Bible or are you guessing? Final investigative challenge. Before rejecting apostolic interpretation, ask yourself, have you examined the entire biblical case file, or have you reached a verdict before investigating the evidence? Like, share, and follow this ministry. See Westside Grace Ministries. Bishop Michael Anthony McDaniel, CSI, Critical Scripture Investigator, FBI, Forensic Bible Investigator, all rights reserved.